Closed qualification matches for the first major of the season have just been finished, being the first event where DPC points for the next TI were issued. Even though these matches were played online, the actual level of performance and stress weren't all that different from big LAN events. That's because Valve have decided to cancel invitations this time, so now qualification matches were being played by the best teams from each region. This kind of format has been a lot more intense to watch than before. Instead of the usual group stage where matches don't really decide anything, we get to see a GSL format where the matches directly influence the place a certain team gets into the playoff grid. Even with that though, the teams weren't losing their chance of winning too early in the tournament, which encouraged everyone to keep fighting until the very end. Each region made it in just 3 days, which made these qualification matches not only interesting to watch, but also quite dynamic. In this clip, we're going to cover the closed qualification for the CIS region, and we'll highlight the most interesting matches over the last few days of the series. In the first round of the qualifiers, we could see the following teams brawling for the right for the upper bracket. Winstrike and Na'Vi secured pretty easy victories against their opponents, but while the former were faced with a mix of open qualifiers, the latter had a much stronger opponent. Espada, which had a very good performance during the qualification series for TI, were among the tournament's favorites up until the main event, but that fact didn't really stop Na'Vi from securing 2 confident victories over their opponents. However, the rest of the matches were a lot more intense. 2 EU teams, which ended up in the CIS qualifier by sheer coincidence, gave real hell to their actual opponents. Virtus.pro had some troubles defeating Team Spirit in their 3 matches, each of which were super intense, and the actual winners weren't clear up until the very end. You could see that VP still weren't used to their new member, and still couldn't tune their playstyle enough to avoid silly mistakes. However, at the end of the day, they still came out on top. However, in the match series between Odium and Elements Pro Gaming, everything went against the plans Odium had from the start. Even after a very decisive victory during the first map, Elements seized the initiative during the second one, and managed to hold Odium off, while the third one went in a completely different direction, with Elements turning the tables and dominating their opponents. This will become a visible trend, since the next series they played against Winstrike, EPG have shown absolutely no remorse during the first match. However, Winstrike weren't ready to give up yet. It was an intense match with a lot of turnarounds, but in the end of the day, Winstrike came out on top. And after that crushing defeat, Elements crumbled, and their third match was an utter failure, with them having no chance of holding Iceberg and his team off. So, even with a very shameful loss at the start of the series and a questionable performance during the second match, Winstrike still took the lead during the last one and have entered the second stage as one of the favorites. At the same time, we had another match between the 2 once rival teams from CIS, Na'Vi and Virtus.pro. Na'Vi were looking good at the start, even though they lost 2 matches, but after a slow start, they managed to seize the initiative and turn the tables, thanks to Magical's confident TA performance. With yet another Aegis on their hands, Na'Vi went for a careless dive on the enemy base, losing the Aegis at first, and then another attempt at doing the same, leading to the death of all their cores and a dieback from Spectre. After that, VP retaliated with a push of their own, which Na'Vi had no way to defend against. The second match, however, went pretty well for Na'Vi, with them having a very good early game. However, they got a bit carried away, and just as the match turned into the mid-game, a couple of unsuccessful team fights later, Virtus.pro could reclaim the upper hand, securing their victory for the series. It wouldn't be true to claim that VP looked unbeatable this time, but after a couple of very intense series, they managed to get used to FN, who was replacing Pasha in the Major. Na'Vi, in their turn, have shown a very solid performance, and were playing toe-to-toe with the team, who didn't even have to play the qualification matches to get to the previous tournament. The first match of this clash turned out to be spectacular, and we recommend anyone who likes CIS Dota, or Dota in general, to take a peek for themselves. By the end of the 2 series, both of the teams which took part in the previous TI were removed from the top 2 places. It's surprising, but there's a reason they're not there. Next up, there were the loser bracket matches. A clash between FurZ and Odium was pretty one-sided, and Odium came out as confident victors at the end of 2 short matches, being completely and utterly dominated by the infamous team. FurZ, on the other hand, looked pretty dull and were sent to wait for the next day, having been placed at the bottom of their group. That kind of thing can be damaging to any team's morale. In the parallel match, the things went a lot more equally. Even though it didn't come to the third match, the clash was still super intense. The first match between Espada and Team Spirit lasted for a full 80 minutes, and every single minute was full of suspense. It wasn't clear who was going to claim the first victory until it was already there. Constant turnarounds and base defenses with no buybacks on either side made this match absolutely mandatory to watch for any hardcore fan. In the end, Team Spirit came out victorious, having managed to hold Mega Creeps back thanks to their amazing macro play and the full use of Coddle's potential. That's not the only intense game they'll play though. The second match was utterly dominated by Team Spirit, and thus, Espada, the contenders of the previous qualifiers, have been sent to the very last place in their group. And the last two events of the day were matches played for the right to stay in the upper bracket. Odium were matched with Elements again, with the latter having their Flame of Fervor snuffed out by Windstrike in the previous match. This time, Lil and the team didn't leave their opponents with any chances, having secured a confident victory in the first match and then finishing it off with the second. In the opposite matchup, Team Spirit gifted us with another intense series. The first map was exceptionally spectacular and went on for more than an hour. The next one, however, was quickly ended by Na'Vi, and then we had the last and final match of the day. This very important match went fairly equally up until a certain point, where Team Spirit could finally catch their opponents off positions. The long day of playing didn't weaken their concentration, and it allowed them to secure their victory, sending them to the upper brackets. Na'Vi displayed a pretty decent performance, but their timely defeat still looked pretty reasonable, especially when you compare them to their cold-blooded opponents. The second day was starting off with the losers bracket, and were eliminating the defeated teams from the tournament. In a couple of quick matches, Espada completely destroyed Elements, sending those pesky Europeans back to where they came from. Elements simply couldn't recover from the crushing defeat they ended their first day with, and thus they looked quite harmless during their final match. The opposite match series, however, looked pretty lively. Furzy, having failed during their first day, have lost their first match against Na'Vi on day 1. However, they reactivated at their darkest hour. During the second match, which went pretty fairly, they managed to hold their opponents off, reclaim the initiative, and secure victory at last. This was the breaking point for Furzy in the qualification matches, blocking the title of wildcards to their name. The final match of the series was completely ruled by them. They crushed all the enemy lanes at the start, which was especially hurtful because of the Alchemist on their side. This crushing defeat for Na'Vi came off as a complete surprise, considering how confident they were earlier in their matches against very strong teams. Next up, we have the upper bracket matches. In a clash between Team Spirit and Windstrike, both of them went somewhat the same way. XFTM went true to their usual playstyle, grabbing some strong early game heroes and using them to seize the advantage by mid game. However, Team Spirit's picks were all about the late game, and they succeeded in stalling the game long enough for them to use that advantage. During both of the matches, Team Spirit were able to fend their opponents off and spread all around the map, using heroes with global spells in their kits, the same thing they've been doing throughout their first day, but even more confident now. Even during the second match, when Windstrike had a solid advantage very quickly, it was obvious that Team Spirit had everything under control. Soon enough, they turned the tables and have secured victory. Windstrike, however, were making some really unexpected mistakes, and just couldn't finish what they started, making their performance look way less confident and uncoordinated than one of their opponents. At the same time, VP were playing against Odium. Not too many people were expecting Odium, a team whose nickname literally translates to hatred, to go far, but not without reason. In the first match, Lil and his team were somehow managing to hold VP off, but to no avail. In the second one, they managed to secure an advantage from the start, and held on to it up until they won. Even though Odium have made a very desperate attempt at base racing, Odium's picks look pretty unusual, just like they did during the first day of the qualifiers, but this time you could really see the lack of an actual game plan. They might have carried themselves through the first day by sheer individual skill, but the second day revealed all their flaws, and made it obvious that they won't be able to do much against more serious teams in the playoffs. In yet another elimination series, we had a clash between the losers of the upper bracket and the winners of the losers bracket, and it was intense. Windstrike started their series against the lucky Furzy and have quickly lost their first match. The second match was more or less equal, but at some point Windstrike managed to set their own rules and actually bring it back. Then they had their final and very intense third match, the outcome of which was decided by just a few skirmishes. One of such moments had Windstrike miss the moment to make use of their advantage, leading to their opponents stealing Aegis and Cheese from the pit, forcing them to use a couple buybacks, and that was the beginning of the end. The next couple of minutes were spent trying as hard as they can to defend high ground, but it's to no avail. In the end, Winstrike are eliminated. They didn't show the level of confidence everyone expected them to show, and they couldn't adapt their playstyle to the new meta of hard carries and comebacks. Furzy, in their turn, didn't have much to lose, and thus have gotten a second win, strong enough to let them play a very vivid match. After all, they had more than enough of strong players to make it work. In the second elimination series, Espada defeated Odium in their third match. The match Odium have actually won was won easily, but the sheer amount of power they had at the start didn't last long. So, the third match was lost without too many chances for recovery. Lil and his team were playing some pretty unusual heroes throughout the qualifiers, but Espada just looked a lot more coordinated, so they deserved to go further than Odium. The final series of the day was a clash between Espada and the lucky guys from Open Quals, who have suddenly gathered enough strength to pass through the second day of the event. The first two matches looked like a fair trade when both teams took turns on each other without any real beef happening. But then, the third match happened. Espada seized a solid advantage at the start, but couldn't make anything good out of it during the mid-game. Furzy waited for their moment of truth and then turned the tables with just a couple of lucky teamfights. That was just enough to throw Espada off balance, and thus the wildcards were left victorious, waiting to see their final opponents. Espada had very good performances throughout both days, however they just didn't have what it takes to defeat the crazy Furzis, who were simply robbed off their chance to visit the Major. So, by the end of the second day, we only have 3 teams remaining, only 2 of which are destined to make their way to the oncoming Major. Virtus Pro and Team Spirit clashed in the finals of the upper bracket, fighting for the first batch of tickets. The first match was a confident win for VP, and they managed to gain the upper hand during the mid-game, using it to secure their victory. In the second match, Team Spirit managed to pull their signature pickoff, which, if you don't already know, revolves around the very deep late game. The start of the match went very well for them, and so the Team Spirit could slowly but methodically finish the match in their favor, just like they like it, in a little over 70 minutes. But unfortunately for them, they weren't able to repeat that kind of success during the third match. Their Alchemist draft was working fairly well at the start, but a couple of shameful mistakes during the mid-game granted VP with enough advantage to punch through defenses and secure the first set of major tickets for themselves. The fate of the second batch was being sealed in the lower bracket finals, where Team Spirit, having just lost their match, were going to face the infamous wildcards of the event. This will be a series both of these teams will remember for quite a while. In the first match, Team Spirit, being led by FNG, quickly seized the initiative, which they then grew rapidly through endless ganks and track kills. The gold advantage reached 5-digit numbers, first by 30 minutes in, and then by 40 minutes. However, both of them ceased and lowered by some very successful raids coming from the Furzis. By the end of the third and unsuccessful fight, Furzis made a comeback, strong enough to kick Team Spirit completely off their feet. But they couldn't crush that as easily as they did with the rest of their opponents. They actually had to spend 2 hours to have the game meet its logical conclusion, and even though the initiative was in the hands of Furzy at all times, Team Spirit weren't ready to give up just yet. Time and time again, they were able to defend their high ground, reaching out for a chance to be part of the much bigger event. The match has gotten to a point where complete map control with all the bounty runes and Roshan didn't mean anything anymore, only making Team Furzy get crushed against the enemy defenses, even when it actually looked like they can't hold it any longer. Storm Spirit has reached his absolute and utter maximum, and Team Spirit have used that moment to try to make a comeback. The match has slowed down while Furzy, being desperate to win, have started to look for other ways to crush their opponents, through Necronomicon for example, but it's rather late for that now. In the end, Team Spirit's advantage reached a crazy amount of gold, and they've actually started to reach enemy structures. And when it actually started to look like they had it all, they've entered a fully fledged 5-on-5 teamfight in the enemy base, using all buybacks they've had and failing to achieve anything at all. The sheer positional advantage has allowed Furzy to come out as winners of that teamfight, and Team Spirit simply had no resources left to keep up. A desperate attempt to finish the match ended up with a complete and utter failure, and tickets to the Major were claimed by a previously unknown mix from the Open Quals, guys who were actually considered the weakest of the batch at day 1. FNG and his team, on the other hand, looked quite promising throughout the entire event, and yet they're left with nothing. Every single one of the series was packed with difficulties, which they persevered with a huge amount of confidence, only being second to the main favorites of the event, that being Virtus Pro. However, their well-calculated and educated playstyle was crushed by sheer, hectic aggression coming from 5 guys with little to no organization and hardly any financing. Their high-level individual skills, high morale, and extreme amount of motivation, and perhaps more importantly stress resistance, made the recipe for their success in the qualifiers, which is more or less the trademark of the CIS region. And that's exactly what the final match of the event has shown to us today. Both of these teams made it into something truly beautiful. The icing on the cake of those intense qualifiers put an end to the endless stream of events that were happening during those 3 stressful days. These qualifiers were captivating, and their results were as unpredictable as they could be. All of the teams taking part in it made sure that the spectators would witness a true grinder of an event, and the stakes being so high and the risk being so unbearable made it even better to boot. We're sure that every single one of those people who watched this show enjoyed it as much as we did, but the ones who have happened to miss it now have this little clip we've prepared for them, containing all the highlights and spectacular moments they might have missed out on otherwise.